Every civilization that reaches the stars learns, eventually, that there are rules. Not laws exactly, because there is no authority in the galaxy with sufficient reach to enforce laws across the distances involved. Rules, understandings, the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of spacefaring species learning, mostly through painful experience, what you do not do if you want to continue existing in reasonable comfort. Do not interfere with the developmental trajectory of a pre-warp civilization without commission authorization. Do not harvest biological material from a protected ecosystem without filing the appropriate permits. Do not approach a Up.HFY ship without broadcasting the standard non-aggression signal on the designated frequency, unless you have a specific death wish, in which case approach at whatever frequency you like. These rules are taught to every new spacefaring species as part of the standard orientation package, the broad strokes of how the galactic community functions and what it expects from its members. Most of the rules are explained with reference to the logic behind them. Most of the rules have footnotes, addenda, clarifying amendments. Most of the rules, if you read them carefully, contain within themselves the argument for why they exist. There is one rule that has no footnotes, no addenda, no clarifying amendments, no explanation of the logic. It is the shortest entry in the entire orientation package, and it has been the shortest entry for as long as anyone can find records of the orientation package existing, which is approximately 3,000 years. The rule says, do not deliberately provoke, threaten, or initiate hostile action against the species designated Sol 3 dominant, commonly known as humanity, or against any human individual, settlement, vessel, or territorial claim. It does not say why. Every new spacefaring species that receives the orientation package asks why. The answer they receive is always the same. The answer is, read the histories. The histories are long. The histories are, in several places, extremely uncomfortable reading. But if you want to understand the rule, they are what you have. The first history begins approximately 2,900 years ago, before the rule existed in anything like its current form, when a species called the Tavith made first contact with humanity during what the humans would later call their early space age. The Tavith were not a malicious species. This is important to say clearly, because the story of what happened to them has sometimes been told in ways that cast them as villains, and they were not villains. They were a cautious, methodical, highly intelligent civilization that had been spacefaring for approximately 400 years, and that had, in those 400 years, developed a set of first contact protocols that were considered, at the time, among the most sophisticated and ethically rigorous in the known galaxy. The protocols were designed to protect developing civilizations from the shock of contact before they were ready, to introduce the concept of galactic community gradually and in stages, to allow the developing species to acclimate to the knowledge of their non-uniqueness in the universe before any more complex engagement began. The Tavith were proud of their protocols. They had good reason to be. The protocols had guided 17 successful first contacts without incident. The humans were to be the 18th. The Tavith's assessment of humanity, conducted from a distance over the course of 2 decades before any contact was initiated, concluded that the humans were at a stage of development that the protocols designated as acclimation ready, meaning they had achieved global communication, had begun space exploration, and had produced sufficient philosophical and cultural material dealing with the concept of extraterrestrial life that the initial revelation of its existence was unlikely to produce civilizational collapse. The Tavith were correct about this. Where they were incorrect, in a way that their protocols had never needed to account for before, was in their assumption about what the humans would do once contact was established and the acclimation process began. The protocols assumed a particular shape for the acclimation process: reveal existence, allow processing time, reveal more, allow more processing time, gradually expand the scope of what the developing species knew until they were ready for full engagement. The protocols assumed, based on 17 prior contacts, that the developing species would follow the shape. The humans did not follow the shape. The humans, upon learning that an extraterrestrial species had made contact and was prepared to introduce them gradually to the concept of galactic community, immediately began asking questions that the protocols had estimated would not be asked for another 2 to 3 decades of gradual acclimation. Where are the Ers? How many are there? What are the political structures? What are the trade relationships? What are the conflicts? What do we need to know to participate fully? The Tavith attempted to apply the protocols. They explained that the information would be shared gradually, in stages, at a pace designed for the developing species' comfort. The humans said, with what the Tavith's records describe as remarkable consistency across all communication channels, that they appreciated the consideration but would prefer the information now. The Tavith said the protocols did not allow for that. The humans said, whose protocols? The Tavith said, ours. The humans said, right, and we are not bound by your protocols, so perhaps you could simply tell us what we are asking. The Tavith's first contact mission returned home 6 months later. Their report recommended immediate revision of the acclimation protocols to include a contingency for species that declined to be acclimated at the recommended pace. The revision was eventually implemented. It is still referred to, in the Tavith's internal documentation, as the human exception. The second history is older than the rule, but is the one most frequently cited as the reason the rule needed to exist, and it involves a species called the Grath Combine, who were, at the time of their encounter with humanity, one of the 3 dominant military powers in this region of the galaxy, and who had a long and largely successful history of establishing their dominance through a combination of overwhelming force and strategic patience that had served them well for over 1,000 years. The Grath Combine did not make first contact with humanity. They made second contact, arriving in the Sol system approximately 60 years after the Tavith's mission, by which point the humans had been in communication with 11 other galactic species, and had developed, in 60 years, what the Grath Combine's intelligence assessment described as a concerning degree of familiarity with galactic political structures for a species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. The Grath Combine's purpose in the Sol system was not primarily to engage with humanity. It was to establish a navigational and resource claim in the outer reaches of the system, specifically in the asteroid belt, which contained material of significant value to several Grath Combine industrial programs, and which the humans had not yet meaningfully developed. The Grath Combine's legal team had reviewed the relevant commission guidelines and determined that the human claim to the asteroid belt was, at the time, legally ambiguous, that the humans had established presence in the belt, but had not filed the formal territorial declarations required for protected status. They proceeded on this basis. They moved 3 industrial vessels into the belt and began extraction operations. The human response was not what the Grath Combine expected. They had anticipated either acquiescence, which would have been convenient, or a formal commission complaint, which would have resulted in lengthy arbitration during which extraction operations could continue, or possibly a military response from the human fleet, which the Grath Combine had assessed as significantly outmatched, and which they had prepared contingency plans to handle efficiently. What they got was all 3 simultaneously, plus several things they had not anticipated at all. The commission complaint was filed within hours of the Grath Combine's arrival, accompanied by a legal brief that the Commission's arbitration office later described as the most thoroughly researched territorial claim argument they had received in 40 years of operation. The human fleet began moving within the same hours, not toward the asteroid belt, which the Grath Combine had prepared for, but toward the primary navigational relay point that the Grath Combine used to maintain communication with their home system, which the Grath Combine had not prepared for because no species had ever thought to threaten a navigational relay during a resource dispute. And at the same time, through channels the Grath Combine's intelligence service was still trying to account for decades later. The humans contacted 6 of the other species currently in commercial relationship with the Grath Combine and shared detailed information about the legal ambiguity argument the Grath Combine had used to justify the extraction operation. The clear implication that the same argument could be applied to any number of other territorial situations the Grath Combine was currently managing. The extraction operation was suspended within 36 hours. The Grath Combine withdrew from the Sol system within a week. The Commission arbitration found in humanity's favor 4 months later. The Grath Combine's Strategic Planning Division spent 2 years revising their engagement frameworks to account for what their senior analyst described as species that apparently treats every dispute as a problem to be solved on every available front simultaneously. The rule that eventually emerged from the galactic community's accumulated experience was not written primarily because of the Grath Combine incident. But the Grath Combine incident is the one that gets cited most often in explanations of why the rule's prohibition on provocation is written so broadly, to include not just military action but any form of hostile action, because the humans, as the Grath Combine discovered, had a definition of responding to hostile action that was significantly more comprehensive than most species expected. The third history is smaller than the first 2 and less frequently cited in the formal explanations of the rule, but it is the one that several xenosociologists have argued is actually the most important, because it is the one that explains not just what happens when you provoke humanity, but why the provoking produces the results it produces, which is the more interesting question. A species called the Velorath, who were peaceful traders with no military ambitions and no territorial disputes with anyone, had been in a reasonably comfortable commercial relationship with several human colonies for about 30 years when they made what their historians later called the mistake of the obvious question. A Velorath trading delegation, during a routine commercial negotiation with representatives of 3 human colony systems, asked the human representatives how they managed to maintain coherent political unity across the distances involved, given that the human colonies were spread across a significant volume of space and human communication technology at the time, while impressive, involved meaningful time delays between distant systems. The human representatives said, "We argue a lot and then we figure it out." The Velorath delegates said, "But what happens when you cannot agree?" The humans said, "We still figure it out, eventually." The Velorath said, "And if eventually is not fast enough?" The humans looked at each other and then the senior representative said, "Then we deal with the emergency first and argue about whose fault it was afterward." The Velorath took this answer back to their political scientists, who spent several years analyzing it, and eventually produced a paper that described what they called the human emergency unity phenomenon, the observation that humans in crisis tended to cohere rather than fragment, that the things which divided them under normal conditions became, under sufficient external pressure, temporarily irrelevant, and that this pattern had repeated so consistently across human history that it appeared to be something closer to an instinct than a policy. The paper concluded with a sentence that made its way into the orientation package's historical appendix, and that several species have credited with clarifying the rule's intent more than the rule itself. The sentence said, "Do not create the emergency. The emergency is when they are most themselves." There is a history that is not in the official records. It is not in the official records because the species involved requested that their experience with humanity be handled as a confidential diplomatic matter, and the Commission, unusually, agreed to the request, and the agreement has held for approximately 400 years. I know about it because I am old enough and have been in the right places at the right times to have heard it from sources I trust, and I'm including it here because I think it is the most honest account of what the rule is really about, stripped of the strategic language and the cautionary framing. A species, which I will not name, made contact with a human settlement that was in the process of responding to a catastrophic failure of their primary life support systems. The settlement was in a remote location. The failure was severe. People were dying. This species, whose name I will not use, arrived in the system and assessed the situation and made a calculation. The calculation was not monstrous. I want to be clear about that. The calculation was the kind that civilizations in positions of power make all the time. A cost-benefit analysis of intervention. A weighing of what assistance would cost against what it would produce. A consideration of what precedent would be set by providing emergency aid to a settlement that had no formal relationship with the arriving species and from whom no return was guaranteed. The calculation concluded that intervention was not in the species' strategic interest and that the appropriate action was to log the distress signal and continue on their way. They continued on their way. The human settlement survived, not because of any other species intervention, but because of the 17 people who were still functional when the life support failure reached its most critical point, and who spent the next 91 hours doing things that the settlement's engineers later said were not possible with the equipment and materials available, and who saved 342 lives through a combination of improvisation and stubbornness, and the refusal, which seems to be a deeply human refusal, to accept that the situation was what it appeared to be. When the rescue fleet arrived from the nearest human colony, 6 days after the crisis, they found a settlement that was damaged and depleted and had lost 61 people, and that was, by any measure, in a very bad state. They also found logs. Complete, detailed, time-stamped logs of everything that had happened during the 91 hours, including the arrival and departure of the species vessel, including the distress signal that had been broadcast, including the automated acknowledgement that confirmed the distress signal had been received. The logs were shared with the human colonial administration. The colonial administration shared them with the Human Diplomatic Corps. The Human Diplomatic Corps did not file a commission complaint. They did not issue a public statement. They did not take any action that could be characterized as hostile or retaliatory. What they did was send a single diplomatic communication to the species in question through private channels that said, "We know you were there. We know you received the signal. We know you chose not to respond. We are not going to do anything about this right now. But we remember everything, and we are going to be in this galaxy for a very long time, and we thought you should know that we know." The species that received that communication spent a great deal of time in the following years understanding what it meant, and what they concluded it meant was this: the humans were not threatening them. The humans were informing them. The information was that the humans had a memory, and that the memory was long, and that the choice made in that system on that day was a permanent part of the record between their species and humanity, and that what happened with that record was going to depend on what happened next. The species in question became, in the following decades, one of the most consistent supporters of expanded human aid access agreements in commission deliberations. They have never publicly explained why. The rule in its current form was formally adopted by the Commission approximately 800 years ago, following a period of increasing galactic contact with humanity that had produced enough documented incidents to make the case for a formal statement. The drafting process took 11 years, which is not unusual for Commission rulemaking, and the debate over the rule's language was, by the accounts of the delegates involved, the most contentious rule drafting process in the Commission's history up to that point, not because anyone disagreed about whether the rule should exist, but because the question of how to explain it kept producing answers that the drafting committee felt were either too alarming or too reductive or too easy to misread, as implying that humanity was a threat to be feared rather than a civilization to be respected. The final language, the version that appears in the orientation package without footnotes or addenda, was proposed by a delegate who had spent 30 years in direct diplomatic engagement with humanity, and who said, at the final drafting session, that the reason the explanation kept coming out wrong was that the committee was trying to explain what happened when you provoked the humans, when the thing that needed to be said was simply that you should not. She said, "The rule does not need to explain itself. Rules that need to explain themselves are rules that people are going to argue with. This rule should not be argued with. It should be understood. And the understanding," she said, "comes from the histories, not from the rule. What the histories tell you, read together and in sequence, is not that humanity is uniquely dangerous, though in specific contexts and under specific conditions they can be. What the histories tell you is something more specific and more interesting and more useful for practical purposes. They tell you that humanity is a species that does not respond to pressure the way most species respond to pressure. Most species, when sufficiently pressured, either yield or escalate in predictable patterns that experienced galactic actors know how to manage. The yield pattern produces negotiated outcomes that the pressuring party can mostly control. The escalate pattern produces conflicts that experienced military powers can mostly manage. The humans do neither of these things reliably. Under pressure, they adapt. Under pressure, they find resources that were not apparent before the pressure was applied. Under pressure, they become more rather than less coherent, more rather than less creative, more rather than less determined to solve the problem in front of them and then remember. Who created it? This is not a mystical quality. It is not supernatural. It is the product of a very specific history, a species that spent hundreds of thousands of years surviving on a planet that was actively trying to kill it, a species that learned, at a level deep enough to have become instinct, that the correct response to an existential problem is not to yield and not to panic, but to figure out what you have and what you can make with it, and do that until the problem is solved or you are not. The galaxy did not make humanity this way. The galaxy is simply where humanity arrived after being made this way, and the galaxy has been, in various ways and with various degrees of grace, adjusting to that fact ever since. There is a question that new spacefaring species ask when they have read the histories and processed what they mean that is different from the first question they ask. The first question is always, what happens if you break the rule? The answer to that question is in the histories. The second question, the one that comes after the histories have been read carefully, is, what happens if you follow it? What does a relationship with humanity look like if you approach it correctly, without provocation, without the kind of calculated pressure that the histories document so thoroughly? This question has a different kind of answer, one that is not in the formal orientation package, but that the Commission's diplomatic corps will share with any new species that asks. The answer is that humanity is one of the most productive partners in the galactic community. That the species which have built genuine relationships with humanity, based on mutual engagement rather than hierarchy, on straightforward communication rather than strategic maneuvering, have found in humanity a level of commitment and resourcefulness and creative problem-solving that is, by the assessment of several elder civilizations with thousands of years of interspecies relationships to compare against, genuinely exceptional. The Velorath, who asked the obvious question about political unity and received the answer about arguing and figuring it out, have been in a continuous commercial and scientific partnership with humanity for 600 years. It is the longest partnership in their history, and the one their economists cite most often when discussing what productive interspecies exchange looks like. The Taveth, whose protocols were rearranged by humans who declined to be acclimated on schedule, revised those protocols and went on to use the revised version in 43 subsequent first contacts. They credit the human exception, without irony, as the improvement that made their protocols genuinely functional. Even the Grath Combine, who had their extraction operation interrupted, and their trade relationships quietly destabilized in 36 hours, eventually built a working diplomatic relationship with humanity that their own historians describe as the most honest relationship in their external affairs, because the humans had demonstrated early and clearly that dishonest dealing had consequences, and the Grath Combine, being a pragmatic species, had adjusted accordingly. The rule exists because the histories exist, and the histories exist because the encounters happened. And the encounters happened because the universe is large and full of civilizations at different stages of development and different levels of wisdom. And some of those civilizations, when they encountered humanity, made choices that seemed reasonable at the time and turned out to be the kind of choices that change the shape of what comes after. The rule is not a warning that humanity is dangerous in the way that a weapon is dangerous, something that causes harm indiscriminately. It is a statement about what happens when the thing you do activates something specific and deep in a species whose depth runs back further than most galactic civilizations' recorded history. It is a statement that says, there is a version of this species that you do not want to encounter, and the version you encounter depends entirely on what you do first. The rule is, in this sense, also a description of an opportunity, because the inverse of do not provoke them is also true. Approach them honestly and they will approach you honestly. Engage with them as equals and they will engage with you as equals. Bring them a genuine problem and watch what happens. Watch how fast they find the edges of it and start looking for the solution and refuse to leave the room until they have found anything, that moves the situation forward. The galaxy has one rule about Earth. The rule is not primarily about fear. It is about paying attention to what you are dealing with before you decide how to deal with it. It is about understanding that the species on the small blue planet did not survive everything their history contains by being easily managed. And it is about the fact that the galaxy, after 3,000 years of documented encounters, has collectively and without much dissent decided that the easiest and most productive path forward is simply to treat them well, to engage with them honestly, and to trust that what comes back will be worth what was put in. There is one more story. It is not in the historical record. It happened recently enough that it has not yet made its way into any official documentation, and I include it here because I think it says something about the rule that the official histories do not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet. A young diplomat from a species that had been spacefaring for less than a generation was assigned to her civilization's first formal mission to a human colony. She was 23 years old by her species' reckoning, and she had read everything her civilization's briefing materials contained about humanity, and she had read the orientation package, and she had read the relevant histories, and she was prepared in the way that a thorough and intelligent young person can be prepared for something they have not yet experienced. She arrived at the colony and she did her work, and at the end of her third week she had dinner with a human family who had offered hospitality in the traditional manner of that particular colony. The family was unremarkable in every sense she could assess. A pair of adults, 3 children of varying ages, the kind of comfortable, ordinary domestic situation that she had read about in the briefing materials and had imagined, and that was, in person, entirely as described and also completely different from being described, in the way that everything is. At the end of the dinner, the eldest child, who was 11, asked her what she thought of humans. She had been asked versions of this question in her 3 weeks at the colony and had developed a diplomatic answer that was accurate and appropriately complimentary. She began to give the diplomatic answer and then stopped herself, thinking of the orientation package and the histories and the Tavith's protocols, and instead she said what was actually true. She said, "I think I am still figuring it out." The child said, "That is fair. Most of us are still figuring it out too." And that answer, which was not in any briefing material and was not in any history and was not in any diplomatic framework, was the answer that she wrote down that night in her personal journal as the most useful thing she had learned in 3 weeks, more useful than the histories and more useful than the rule. Not because it told her what humans were, because it told her what it felt like to be in a room with one of them at the end of an ordinary day. The particular feeling of being in the presence of a species that was, even now, even after everything, still in the middle of figuring itself out and entirely comfortable saying so. The rule has been in the orientation package for 3,000 years. In 3,000 years, No species that received the orientation package and read the histories has voluntarily chosen to break the rule in a significant way. This is not because the rule is enforced. It is not enforced. There is no mechanism for enforcement. The Commission has no authority to compel compliance. It is because the histories are real and the experiences they describe are real, and the species that made the choices described in the histories made them in good faith based on the information they had at the time, and were surprised by the results in ways that left marks on their policies and their institutions and their long-term strategic calculations that did not go away quickly. The rule exists because experience accumulated into wisdom, and wisdom was written down and passed on in the way that useful things get passed on, from one civilization to the next, through the medium of saying, "Here is what we learned, here is what we wish we had known, here is the shortest version of what took us a long time to understand." Do not wake them up, not because they are monsters, not because they will destroy you, because they are exactly what they appear to be, in the histories and in the orientation package, and in the dinner table conversation with an 11-year-old who is still figuring it out, and what they appear to be, when you have read everything and sat with it long enough for it to settle, is a species that has not yet finished becoming what it is going to be, that has been not finishing this since before the rule was written, and that will, in all probability, still be not finishing it long after everyone currently alive in the galaxy has gone wherever living things go when they are done. The rule is 3,000 years old. The humans are older. The rule knows this. The rule has always known this. It is why the rule has no footnotes.